as I've been sitting with all the heaviness of the world, it has become so clear how easy it is to lose hope, to feel overwhelmed by the breadth and magnitude of it all. I was a junior in high school when the mass shooting at Columbine happened. I had friends, soccer teammates who were students of Columbine, who survived that shooting, who, let's be real, still feel the impact of that event in their lives today. I can remember so vividly, like hearing the sirens rush by and the helicopters flying overhead. Our school was just a few miles from Columbine High School. I can remember how surreal it felt, how tragic and horrific it was to hear about what happened, but also how complex the entire thing was. I remember my friends telling me, that Eric and Dylan, they were bullied heavily at their school, and how shocked it was that they had such easy access to guns, and it made me just question, how it could have been different if they didn't have access, if the school had wrapped around them in a different way. God, just what could have been done to prevent this from happening? And, here we are, 23 years later, a full decade after Sandy Hook. So much of me just wants to say, how? Why? And more so, what now? Where do we go from here? It's times like these, it's these deeply, complex and tragic times that make me really grateful for a spiritual life. Our practitioner training class just ended their first year of training, and I was talking to them in their last class about the spiritual path and what happens on the Buddhist path when you become a Buddhist, of which I also am. I'm a Buddhist officially, but I'm also a New Thought CSL minister. Something I love about this tradition is, I can bring all of my history, and no matter what religious path we've taken, it's embraced here. It's fully embraced here. So I just want to remind everybody of that, and I love how we can keep our spiritual identities. We can reclaim them in a certain way here without any question or exclusion, So when you become a Buddhist, you take a vow, and you take a vow to take refuge in three things. You take refuge in the Buddha, or the example, or the teacher, the Dharma, or the teaching, and the Sangha, or the community, right? Taking refuge means relying upon, of allowing myself to be sheltered by, to be nurtured by, to be informed and instructed by those three jewels, as they are known in Buddhism as the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. As the talk title today is Better Days, I don't want to offer you some platitude of, hey, everything's going to be okay if we only have faith. If someone said that to me, I'd slap them in the face. I would slap myself in the face if I heard those words coming out of my mouth, So I'm not going to do that. What I instead want to do, what I want to offer is a little framework for taking refuge in these three jewels of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, the teacher, the teaching, and the community, that allow us to not give up hope for better days, To know that we each have a part to play, a role to play, both individually and collectively, to ensure that those better days, actually come to be. So let's start with taking refuge in the Buddha. Now, traditionally in the Buddhist path, this means taking refuge, taking heart in the example of the Buddha, right? Who became enlightened, who became awake. The Buddha, as the example, is meant to give us this kind of hope, this compass, this kind of awakening that actually enlightenment is possible. This can be especially helpful when we become frustrated or discouraged along our spiritual path. The Buddha was not a god or even the offspring of God. He was just a simple human being like you and me who became awake. And in fact, his awakening came from his ability to see into the suffering of the world. He did not turn away from it. He did not turn away from tragedy. He was deeply awake to all that was occurring in the world, all that makes this being human really complex. The writer and activist Glennon Doyle writes about her daughter Tish in a way that reminds me of like the Buddha's nature. Here's what she says about her daughter. She says, Tish is sensitive, and that is her superpower. The opposite of sensitive is not brave. It's not brave to refuse to pay attention, to refuse to notice, to refuse to feel and know and imagine. The opposite of sensitive is insensitive, and that's no badge of honor. You know, in the context that we are having today, of the conversation we're having today about better days in the midst of tragedy, you know, I am taking refuge in people like Glennon Doyle's daughter, Tish, who let their sensitivity wake them up to the world. You know, so if you're hurting right now, I invite you to allow that to be a symbol and proof of your bravery as well. You know, and I am also taking refuge in, I am taking refuge in not just people that are here and that are alive, awake, and aware, but also like I'm taking refuge in so many people that have come before, especially in our country, who have faced, you know, what we are facing in their own way, during their own time, and met it with this kind of resilience and with love and with this power within, you know, because here, listen, I realize that this country has always been one that has relied upon its people that are sensitive and brave enough to wake up to the world around them and seek to create change in the world. You know, these people are the ones that create more life, more liberty, and more availability to pursue happiness. You know, my and so many others' ability to do this is built upon this long history, especially around the history of voting, which I want to use as an example of like how to really lean into those who have come before as an act of resilience, as a way to keep hope, as people we can draw upon in this particular time. Because even the simple act of voting was fought for by so many that have come before, even though we take voting for granted today, like, just over 50% of us vote in our presidential elections, and it's way lower in non-presidential years, right? It's way less. It's something that wasn't always present for everyone, you know? Barriers and suppression of voting rights have also been a legacy of this country. When our country was founded, only a tiny fraction of the people in this room or watching online could have voted, right? So in our first presidential election, does anyone know what percentage of the population could actually vote? It was 6%. 6% of the population was eligible to vote. Like, that is astounding. I wonder what the turnout was like back then. It's basically like, we got like 50 dudes, like, hey guys, hope you can come out for the vote, you know, it's gonna be great, you know, hope you all can make it. No, voting was reserved for this very small population. It was reserved for wealthy white male landowners. You know, I would not have legally had the right to vote when our country was founded, nor would many of us here in this room and watching online. You know, countless people have given their everything to bring more voices into the electoral process. Dude, the women's suffrage movement lasted for nearly a century. Can you imagine that? A century. It's like there were women that were part of that movement, men and women, that went their entire lives without seeing that coming to fruition, that knew they had to do everything they could so that could continue on, and so that the next generation could continue that fight, so that could be a right that is held today. God, that is resilience. That is something I want to lean into, like that kind of fortitude, that kind of determination. God, that kind of hope, that kind of refusal to give up on hope, right? In 1870, 5 years after the abolition of slavery, it became illegal for states to prevent voting based on race. While this extended the right to vote to black men in the South, political leaders of the post-Civil War Reconstruction and Jim Crow enacted a slew of measures to keep African Americans from the polls. This included making black voters pass literacy tests, mandating voters to pay a tax to cast a ballot, requiring black voters to get a white person to vouch for them, white-only Democratic primaries in southern states, and outright voter intimidation violence against African Americans at the polls, right? The civil rights movement was about addressing all of that BS and creating more rights in the country for so many more of us. And today, we are continuing to see how that the racism of our history was so deeply embedded into our institutions that we are continuing that fight today. That story lives on with us, right? And so when we allow our history to inform our present, when I feel both the weight of that, right, as well as the inspiration, the fortitude, the heart of those who have come before, who gave their energy and time, and God, even their lives for this, it makes me feel connected to the past in a way that gives me hope for the future. Like we come from a legacy of change makers. And I know that matters, and though there are so many things that feel so big, so daunting, so unbelievably gridlocked right now, I can take refuge in all of those Buddhas and Bodhisattvas who came before, who are present and alive today, who fought even over the course of a lifetime to create change in our country, right? We all can do this. We can see how their efforts were not futile, that without that kind of belief and hope and resilience, many of us would not have the rights that we do today. So I invite us to take refuge in that, to lean into that legacy, to allow their examples to give us that resilience and the courage that is being asked of us right now as a community of Americans that are seeking to create more safety in our country, right? Which brings us to the second jewel of taking refuge, not in just the example, but also the Dharma or the teaching. There's something really special about this particular philosophy that we are part of, the spiritual path that we are on. It is rooted in the premise and the promise that each one of us is connected to, is born from, is rooted in the divine, in this greatest power in the universe, in the same power that birthed the planets and the stars, and the same divine energy that is the center of life itself, of love itself. It's one of these things that continually inspires me and motivates me about the spiritual path. It always asks me to continue to create, right? To continue to choose, despite what has happened in my past, despite what my current reality looks like. It's this radical thought. It's actually a super bold theology that unites us with an invitation to take a conscious part in the creation of our lives and the co-creation of the worlds in which we live. I know I've often struggled with really giving myself fully over to this idea, to this principle that we are building on the past, but we are not bound by it. It gives me courage to feel my place in history and know that this particular moment in time has never come before, and that from this very moment on, we are creating something new. Thomas Troward is probably one of the more influential writers in New Thought, who had this big impact on our founder, Ernest Holmes. He writes in his essay, The Creative Process in the Individual, relying on the maxim that principle is not bound by precedent, we should not limit our expectations of the future. And if our speculations lead us to the conclusion that we have reached a point where we're not only able, but also required by the law of our own being to take a more active part in our personal evolution, this discovery will afford us a new outlook upon life and widen our horizon with fresh interest and brightening hope. I love this idea that not only are we at any moment, not only are we able, but we are required to take a more active part in our evolution. It's demanding of us that we never give up hope because we are not bound by what has come before or even what is. We are instead bound to this principle of co-creation, of possibility, of expecting better days. We're bound to that no matter what. It's as if a part of our divine birthright, it's embedded as a part of this experience of being human, kind of like the act of voting. It's this co-creative nature that we're all a part of, this deep belief that we have agency in our lives that comes from our absolute oneness with the spirit of the divine, with the universe itself. And with that, not only do we have the power to create the world we want to see, there's something in us and within us that feels and knows that we're also required to do so. We're always being required to create anew again and again and again. It's a part of our legacy. It asks us to continually co-create. In the midst of hate and bigotry, it's love. In the midst of chaos, peace. It's in the midst of helplessness, hope. And speaking of love, it's this last jewel of taking refuge in the Sangha is perhaps the most important of them all, right? Like we need to take refuge in each other. We need to take refuge in the community, the fellow travelers along the path. It asks that we be in community together, to grieve together, to share the burdens of our souls so that those burdens may be released. It asks that we take refuge in each other so we don't fall into that kind of isolation and get caught in the thoughts that make us feel small or that we can't make change in the world. Because the truth is, right, like we are always a part of something greater. And we must be reminded of our beloved community, our Sangha, our chosen family that are right there along with us. There are people that are grieving with us right now, that are hoping with us, that are cursing and raging with us, that are taking up the baton for us when we run out of energy, when we're feeling overwhelmed, and that are giving it back when we're refueled and ready to take the baton for them. You know, we aren't alone in these pursuits for more justice, more safety, and more equity in the world. We aren't alone in believing these changes are possible. We aren't alone when we feel overwhelmed by it all. You know, one of my favorite authors, Valerie Kaur, we quote her all the time in this community, but this is what she has to say about all this. She says, "Those we grieve with, those we sit with and weep with are ultimately those we organize with and advocate for. When a critical mass of people come together to wonder about one another, to grieve with one another, and fight with and for one another, we begin to build the solidarity needed for collective liberation and transformation, a solidarity rooted in love." You know, so one way we can take refuge in the Sangha is to participate in ways of taking collective action together. So Reverend Shannon mentioned last week a couple of organizations that we're going to be working with. And so our Minister Emeritus, Reverend Sally, is going to be here. She's right there in the back. She's going to be here taking signatures for an initiative that can help move the state of Oregon forward in this issue of safety and guns in our country. It turns out Angie as well, who's on our piano today, she is also collecting signatures, and she just happened to have her clipboard with her today, so she's going to be downstairs if y'all are hanging out in the fellowship hall taking signatures as well. So, listen, better days are coming, friends. And we truly are standing on holy ground right now. Yet we must take an active role in creating those better days by taking refuge in, by leaning into those who have come before, by drawing hope and inspiration by their lived example, by going to the spiritual truths and taking refuge in the Dharma, and ancient teachings that are rooted in wisdom that grant us the mindset and spiritual practice of knowing we are one with the divine, and through that, co-creators with the great creator. And that when we gather together, like when we are in community together, we can regain the wholeness of who we are. All our rage, all our hopelessness, all our inspiration, and all of our power. And it is from that place we can truly know how strong, how resilient, and how invincible we are. So I want to close today with a quote from Dr. Ernest Holmes. This is a quote he wrote, or from a piece he wrote during the Korean War. He says, "The world is perhaps at the point of the greatest crisis in all human history. And there seem to be two attitudes we can assume. One is calmness, faith, and conviction, and the other would be despair. And despair is unthinkable. Let each, in their own way, dedicate their time, their service, their hope, and their spiritual conviction to the common cause of liberty and justice for all. And let's work without tiring and pray without ceasing. We know that on the battlefront and in the rear guard, something alive with meaning is taking place. Something vibrant with hope is happening. Something latent with the possibility of the future is being conceived."
Hi, friends. I hope that our message inspired you today. I want to give you an opportunity to pay it forward. We are able to do all that we do here. We're able to get this message to you wherever you are in the world based on contributions. We're a nonprofit. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity to do that, to pay it forward. You can click the link in the description box below or go to our website. No amount is too small or too big. We are so grateful. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in. Know that you are loved. Mwah. Have a good week.